There is a place on the map of the Horn of Africa where the cartographers stop, not because they ran out of space, not because there is nothing there, but because no one has agreed on what to call it, who owns it, who speaks for it, or whether the lines that surround it on every side have any meaning to the people who actually live inside them. Every major mapping agency in the world, every satellite image platform, every political atlas produced in the last 70 years handles this zone in the same way. They draw the borders up to a certain point, and then they leave a gap, or they shade it differently, or they mark it with a notation that essentially means we know something is here, but we cannot tell you what it is called or who it belongs to. And when you first notice this, when you zoom in on a digital map or flip through an atlas and realize that the same patch of Earth is handled with the same careful ambiguity by sources that disagree about almost everything else, it is one of those moments where your understanding of the world quietly shifts in a way it does not shift back from. Because maps are supposed to be answers, we treat them as certainties. Here is the line. Here is the name. Here is who decided. But the blank space on the Somalia-Ethiopia border is a question that has been asked for over a century and has never been fully answered. And the story of why that blank exists is a story that contains within it the entire history of colonial ambition, pastoral survival, Cold War maneuvering, post-colonial state failure, resource competition, and the irreducible stubbornness of people who have lived in a landscape for so long that no outside power has ever quite managed to tell them who they are supposed to be. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world the way it actually works. Not the sanitized version, not the 30-second summary, but the real thing, the deep thing, the thing that changes how you see everything else once you know it. Let's go. The blank space has a name, though the name itself is contested, depending on who you ask and what political position they hold. The region is most commonly referred to as the Ogaden, though Ethiopian authorities have officially renamed the surrounding administrative area the Somali Regional State, and Somali nationalists use names that imply a different political reality than either of those choices suggests. The Ogaden is a vast plateau in southeastern Ethiopia, roughly the size of France, high and dry, and swept by winds that come off the plains and carry dust across a landscape of acacia scrub and seasonal rivers that run hard for a few weeks each year and then disappear back into the cracked clay earth. It is not a blank space in the physical sense. It is full of life. It is full of people. What it is empty of is settled consensus about its political identity, and that emptiness has shaped the last 150 years of history in the Horn of Africa more profoundly than almost any other single factor. To understand why the cartographers hesitate, you need to go back to the late 19th century, to a period when European powers were in the process of drawing lines across Africa with a speed and confidence that bore almost no relationship to their actual knowledge of the territories they were dividing. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 had established the rules of the game, if you can call them rules, which essentially codified the principle that European powers could claim African territory by establishing effective occupation, and that the boundaries between their claims would be negotiated in European capitals by men who had in many cases never visited the places they were partitioning, and who were working from maps that were, to put it generously, provisional. In the Horn of Africa, the relevant European powers were Britain, France, Italy, and, unusually, Ethiopia itself, which under Emperor Menelik II was the only African state that managed to resist formal colonization and indeed to engage as a player in the colonial partition rather than purely as its object. Britain was established in what is now northern Somaliland, claiming the coast opposite Aden, which they needed to supply their garrison there. Italy was moving into what is now Eritrea and the southern coast of Somalia. France was establishing Djibouti. And Ethiopia, which had recently modernized its military with European weapons and advisors, was pushing its frontiers outward in all directions, with an energy that the European powers found simultaneously admirable and inconvenient. The Ogaden Plateau was at the center of all of this. It was a territory inhabited primarily by Somali-speaking pastoralists, clans, and subclans, organized around the movement of camels and cattle and goats across a landscape that had no fixed boundaries because the pastoral way of life requires mobility, requires the freedom to move animals to water and grazing that shifts with the seasons and the rains. The people who lived in the Ogaden did not think of themselves as subjects of any empire, Ethiopian or European. They thought of themselves as members of specific clans, organized within a specific customary legal framework called Zir, which regulated the relationships between groups, the compensation for harms, the rights to water and grazing, in a way that had sustained life in this landscape for centuries, without any need for the kind of fixed territorial sovereignty that European political thought assumed was the natural condition of human organization. Into this world came the treaty makers. Britain signed agreements with Ethiopian authorities that were supposed to define the boundary between the British Somaliland Protectorate and Ethiopian territory. Italy signed agreements that were supposed to do the same for Italian Somaliland in the south. And the agreements they signed contained a provision that would become one of the most consequential small pieces of diplomatic language in the history of the Horn of Africa. They established that the boundary should be drawn in a way that did not, and this is the language that matters, cut off the Somali tribes from their grazing grounds. This was a recognition, however imperfect, that the pastoral life of the Somali clans in the region was incompatible with a fixed line across the landscape. They were acknowledging that the line could not be absolute. But they drew it anyway. Or rather, they agreed that a line would be drawn at some future point when proper surveys had been conducted, which in the language of late 19th century colonial administration meant when we get around to it. And in the case of the Ogaden, they largely never got around to it. The surveys were incomplete. The markers were not placed with any consistency. The treaty language was vague in ways that each party interpreted differently, almost immediately after signing. And the result was what cartographers call an undefined or undetermined boundary, which is a polite technical way of saying that the line was never really established with enough precision and agreement to resolve the questions it was supposed to resolve. The Ogaden existed in a kind of legal limbo from the moment the colonial powers tried to carve it up, and that limbo has never fully resolved. Now I want you to understand something about the physical landscape of the Ogaden, because it matters for everything that follows. This is not a landscape that passive observation can fully convey. The Ogaden Plateau sits at an altitude of roughly 500 to 1,500 meters, lower than the Ethiopian highlands to the north and west, which is why it receives less rainfall and has a drier, more arid character. The dominant vegetation is Acacia commiphora bushland, the kind of thorny, sparse scrub that defines the dry lowlands of the Horn of Africa, punctuated by seasonal rivers called wadis or tagas, which in good rain years can be flowing corridors of green, and in bad years are nothing but sandy channels, where the memory of water is preserved in the dry vegetation along their banks. The climate is defined by two rainy seasons, the longer Gu rains that arrive between April and June, and the shorter Dayer rains that come between October and November. But the rainfall is not reliable. It is highly variable from year to year and from place to place, and the pastoralists of the Ogaden have developed over centuries a sophisticated system for managing this variability. They read the landscape constantly. They track the movements of rain clouds, the behavior of indicator plants, the reports of other herders moving through the system. They make decisions about where to move their animals based on a knowledge of the landscape that is enormously detailed and enormously dynamic, because the landscape itself is enormously dynamic. The camels are the core of this system. A camel in the Ogaden is not just an animal. It is a form of savings, a unit of wealth, a diplomatic tool, a bride price asset, a source of milk that can sustain a family through a drought that would kill cattle, and a creature capable of ranging 40 to 60 kilometers a day in search of grazing and water, allowing the herder to exploit resources that are inaccessible to any other form of livestock keeping in this environment. The relationship between the Somali pastoralist and the camel is one of those deep coevolutionary partnerships that has shaped both the animal and the human over thousands of years, producing a camel that is extraordinarily well adapted to the specific conditions of the Horn of Africa, and a herding culture that is extraordinarily sophisticated in its management of arid landscapes. This is the culture that the colonial boundary makers were attempting to divide with their lines, and the fundamental problem was that this culture had no use for lines. The seasonal movement of herds across the plateau was the mechanism by which the ecosystem sustained human life. You could not draw a line across that movement without threatening the survival of the people whose lives depended on it. The line was not just politically controversial, it was ecologically irrational. It attempted to impose a static division on a dynamic system, and dynamic systems tend, over time, to reassert their dynamism regardless of what lines are drawn across them. For the first half of the 20th century, The Ogaden passed through a series of political arrangements that changed the administrative label on the territory without fundamentally changing the lives of the people who lived there. Ethiopian sovereignty was recognized by the European powers in various treaties, though the Italians occupied the territory during Mussolini's conquest of Ethiopia in the 1930s, incorporating it into their short-lived African empire. After the Second World War, when Italy was stripped of its African colonies and Ethiopia was restored to independence, the Ogaden was returned to Ethiopian administration, and a decision was made by the architects of the post-war international order that would have consequences stretching to the present day. That decision was to accept the colonial borders, however imperfectly drawn, as the borders of the new independent states. This was not a decision born of any principled analysis of where borders should be. It was a pragmatic choice, driven by the recognition that if every contested colonial border in Africa was reopened for renegotiation, the result would be chaos that would never resolve. The Organization of African Unity, founded in 1963, enshrined this principle as a cornerstone of African international relations. Colonial borders, whatever their flaws, were to be respected. The alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. But in the case of the Ogaden, this principle ran directly into a competing principle that was equally important to the people most affected. That principle was the right of people to self-determination. The Somali-speaking people of the Ogaden were being assigned to Ethiopian sovereignty, not because they had any historical relationship with the Ethiopian state, not because they spoke Amharic or practiced the Orthodox Christianity of the Ethiopian highlands, not because their customary law or their clan structure or their economic life had anything to do with the administrative system of Addis Ababa, but purely because the lines that European diplomats had drawn 70 years earlier happened to fall in a way that put them inside the Ethiopian side of the boundary. In 1960, when the former British Somaliland Protectorate and the former Italian Trust Territory of Somalia merged to form the Independent Republic of Somalia, the new state's constitution expressed an explicit aspiration to unite all Somali-speaking people in the Horn of Africa, including those in the Ogaden, in what was sometimes called Greater Somalia or the Somali Nation. The Somali flag at independence featured a 5-pointed star, each point representing one of the territories with significant Somali populations: the former British Protectorate, the former Italian territory, the French territory of what is now Djibouti, the Northern Frontier District of Kenya, and the Ogaden. This was a declaration, built into the visual symbol of the state, that the borders drawn by the Europeans were not accepted as final. Ethiopia, for obvious reasons, did not share this view. The result was an armed conflict almost immediately. Somali armed irregulars, supported to varying degrees by the Somali government, began operations in the Ogaden and the surrounding areas in the early 1960s, fighting for unification with Somalia. Ethiopia responded with military force, and a low-level insurgency continued through the decade, punctuated by periods of negotiation and ceasefire that never produced a lasting settlement. The territory was contested in the most literal sense. Men with guns were dying over it, and the question of who it belonged to was as far from resolution as it had ever been. Then came the Ogaden War of 1977 and 1978, which is one of the most extraordinary episodes in Cold War history and one of the least understood outside of the Horn of Africa itself. By 1977, the political landscape of the region had been completely transformed by revolution. In Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, who had ruled since 1930 and had survived the Italian occupation and become a symbol of African resistance to colonialism, had been overthrown in 1974 by a military committee called the Derg, led by an officer named Mengistu Haile Mariam, who proceeded to install one of the most brutal Marxist regimes in African history. In Somalia, the government of Siad Barre had been in power since 1969, also presenting itself as socialist, also aligned in the early 1970s with the Soviet Union. So you had two Soviet-aligned states fighting each other over the Ogaden. This was not the kind of proxy conflict the Cold War was supposed to produce, and it produced a crisis in Soviet foreign policy that revealed, perhaps more clearly than any other episode of the era, the fundamental absurdity of trying to manage African politics through ideological categories that had been developed for European circumstances. Siad Barre, seeing Ethiopia weakened by its internal revolution and sensing an opportunity to finally resolve the Ogaden question by force, launched a conventional military invasion in July 1977. The Somali National Army, equipped with Soviet-supplied tanks and aircraft, swept across the plateau with remarkable speed. Within months, Somali forces controlled roughly 90% of the Ogaden, including the key regional capital of Jijjiga, and were advancing toward the strategic city of Harar and the logistical hub of Dire Dawa. It looked for a moment as though the Ogaden question was about to be resolved by military fait accompli. What happened next is one of the great pivots of Cold War history. The Soviet Union, faced with the choice between its Somali ally and its new Ethiopian ally, chose Ethiopia. The reasoning was straightforward by the brutal arithmetic of superpower competition. Ethiopia was a much larger country, with a much larger population and a much greater strategic significance in terms of controlling the Red Sea approaches and the Horn of Africa. Somalia was smaller and could be replaced in the Soviet orbit of influence by the United States, which was already in conversation with Siad Barre about switching sides. The Soviets pulled their advisors and their arms from Somalia and began a massive airlift of military equipment to Ethiopia. Cuba, which was deeply involved in supporting Soviet-aligned states in Africa, sent combat troops, eventually tens of thousands of them, and Cuban armored units played a decisive role in the counteroffensive that followed. By March 1978, the tide had completely turned. Ethiopian forces, reinforced by Soviet equipment and Cuban soldiers, had driven the Somali army back across the internationally recognized border. The Ogaden was back under Ethiopian control. Somalia was defeated, and the geopolitical landscape of the Horn had been reshuffled in ways that would continue to reverberate for decades. But the war did not resolve the underlying question. It simply reasserted the military answer, which is that Ethiopia was strong enough to hold the territory by force. The Somali-speaking people of the Ogaden were still there. Their relationship to the Ethiopian state was still as complicated as it had ever been. The Ogaden National Liberation Front, which had been fighting for either independence or unification with Somalia since the 1970s, continued its insurgency through the 1980s and into the 1990s and beyond, a low-intensity conflict that flickered and flared in a landscape that the outside world largely ignored because it had no oil, no celebrity coverage, and no dramatic single event large enough to force international attention. And through all of this, the maps continued to hedge. Because the fundamental question that the maps were supposed to answer, where exactly is the border and who is on which side of it, had never been definitively settled. Let me be precise about the geographic ambiguity, because it is easy to talk about blank spaces in the abstract and miss what it actually means on the ground. The undefined or poorly delimited sections of the Ethiopia-Somalia border are primarily in two areas. One is in the far south, where the boundary between Ethiopia and Somalia approaches the Kenyan border in a region called the Dolo area, and where the precise location of the tri-point where the three countries meet has never been formally agreed upon or demarcated. The other is a more extensive zone in the center of the border, where the line agreed in principle in late 19th century treaties was never properly surveyed and physically marked on the landscape. When cartographers encounter this situation, they have a limited set of options. They can draw a line based on the best available treaty evidence and label it as approximate or disputed. They can shade the zone between conflicting claims as contested territory. They can simply leave the area unmarked or marked with a notation indicating undetermined boundary. Different agencies and different editions of different maps have made different choices, which is why you can look at 3 different maps of the region and see 3 different representations of the same border that are genuinely inconsistent with each other. This is not cartographic incompetence. It is cartographic honesty about a political reality that has not resolved. The satellite imagery platforms like Google Maps and others have their own way of handling this. If you zoom into the Ethiopia-Somalia border region on a major mapping platform, you will notice that the borderline becomes dotted or dashed rather than solid in the contested sections, a convention that indicates disputed or undetermined boundary. In some areas, the label changes, the regional names shift, the way the territory is colored changes. These are not random decisions. They reflect the considered judgment of the platform's geographic data team about how to represent a situation that has no clean resolution. And the fact that they have to make these choices at all, the fact that the software has a specific visual convention for undetermined boundaries that gets applied to this region, tells you something important about how unresolved the question actually is. Now let me take you into the landscape itself, because the political history is only one dimension of what this blank space contains, and in some ways not the most important one. The Somali clan system is the deepest layer of political organization in the Ogaden, deeper than any state border, older than any colonial treaty, more immediately governing of daily life than any administrative arrangement imposed from Addis Ababa or Mogadishu. Understanding the clan system, even partially, is essential to understanding why the blank space exists and why it persists. Somali society is organized around patrilineal descent, tracing lineage through the male line back to founding ancestors, both historical and legendary, including ultimately the founding ancestors of the Somali people as a whole. The major clan families of Somalia, the Derod, the Hawiye, the Dir, the Rahanwain, the Digil, each contain numerous clans, which contain numerous subclans, which contain numerous lineage groups, which contain individual families. The Ogaden clan itself, despite having given its name to the entire region, is one clan within the Derod clan family, and the region called the Ogaden contains not only Ogaden clan members, but members of multiple other clans with different histories, different territories, different political allegiances, and different relationships to the various states and armed groups that have competed for control of the area. The Exier, the customary law system that governs relations between these groups, is one of the most sophisticated systems of customary international law that exists anywhere in the world, though it receives almost no attention in legal scholarship because it operates entirely outside the formal legal systems that academic lawyers study. The XCR governs compensation for harms, including the killing of members of one group by members of another, through a system of collective liability and payment called Daya, where the responsibility for compensating a victim's family is shared across the killer's lineage group. It governs access to water sources and grazing lands through negotiated agreements between clan elders that can be remarkably precise about timing, quantities, and the conditions under which access rights are suspended or transferred. It governs marriage, property inheritance, dispute resolution, and the conduct of interclan conflict, establishing rules about who can be targeted and who must be protected, even in violent disputes. This system is not perfect. It has never been perfect. It contains within it structures that disadvantage women, mechanisms that can be exploited by powerful lineages, and it has struggled, like all customary law systems, to adapt to circumstances that its founders never imagined, including the introduction of modern weapons that changed the lethality of interclan violence in ways that the traditional XPR compensation rates were not designed to manage. But it is a functional system, a system that has actually governed a large population in a challenging environment for centuries, and it continues to function in the Ogaden today, alongside and sometimes in competition with the formal legal institutions of the Ethiopian state. The pastoral economy that the XER was designed to support is itself a form of genius that takes a long time to fully appreciate. The Ogaden is not a productive agricultural landscape in the conventional sense. The rainfall is too erratic, the soils too thin, the growing season too short, and too uncertain for settled cultivation to be reliable in most of the territory. What the Ogaden does have, in abundance, is graze, vast areas of seasonal grass and acacia scrub that, in good years, can support enormous numbers of livestock. The key to exploiting this resource is mobility. You have to be able to move when the grass is eaten and the water dries up. You have to be able to follow the rain. And the Somali pastoral system is specifically designed to do exactly that. The Ola, the basic unit of pastoral settlement, is a portable village, a group of families, typically connected by kinship, who move together as a unit, setting up their akal, their dome-shaped portable houses made of bent saplings and woven mats, near a water source and a patch of good grazing, and then dismantling and moving the entire settlement when the resources are exhausted. The akal can be assembled and disassembled in a matter of hours by women, who are the primary architects and builders of these structures, and a family's entire household kit can be loaded onto camels for the move to the next location. This is not poverty. This is an elegant solution to the logistics of life in an unpredictable arid landscape, and it is a solution that has sustained human populations in the Horn of Africa for a very long time. The political implications of this mobility are profound. A population that moves regularly across a landscape does not have the same relationship to fixed territory that a settled agricultural population has. The pastoralist's political identity is not attached to a piece of land in the way that a farmer's political identity is attached to a field or a village. It is attached to a group, a lineage, a clan. And because the group is mobile, because the group's range covers thousands of square kilometers in the course of a year's movement, any attempt to draw a fixed border across that range is going to create conflict with the basic requirements of the pastoral way of life. The pastoralist will cross the border when the water and grass are on the other side, because the alternative is to watch the animals die. And when enough people are doing that, the border becomes, in practical terms, meaningless, whatever the maps say. This is the essential tension at the heart of the Ogaden question. It is a tension between two different conceptions of how territory and identity and sovereignty are organized. One conception, the conception of the modern state system, the conception embedded in the United Nations Charter and the Organization of African Unity's founding principles, is that territory is fixed, borders are sacrosanct, and political identity is attached to a specific bounded piece of land, administered by a specific government. The other conception, the conception embedded in Somali pastoral society and its legal and economic systems, is that territory is shared and negotiated and mobile, that access rights are determined by custom and season and negotiation between groups, and that political identity is attached to people and lineage rather than to land. These two conceptions are not just different. In important respects, they are incompatible, and the blank space on the map is, in a sense, the map's acknowledgement of that incompatibility. Here is the place, the cartographer is saying, where our system of representation runs into something it was not designed to handle. The discovery of natural gas in the Ogaden added a layer of economic urgency to what had previously been primarily a humanitarian and political crisis. Large gas reserves were identified in the region in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and the involvement of international energy companies, including Chinese state energy firms that signed exploration agreements with the Ethiopian government, brought new money, new infrastructure, and new violence to a landscape that already had more than enough of the latter. The ONLF, the Ogaden National Liberation Front, attacked Chinese oil workers and their Ethiopian military escorts in 2007, killing over 70 people and forcing the Chinese company to suspend operations. The Ethiopian government responded with a military campaign in the region that human rights organizations described as involving collective punishment of civilian communities, destruction of villages, and the obstruction of food and water access in a territory that was already experiencing drought conditions. The reports of that period from organizations like Human Rights Watch describe a humanitarian situation of extreme severity, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced and food aid blocked from reaching affected communities. But the international response was limited, because the Ogaden is remote, because the populations involved have no powerful diaspora advocating for them in Western capitals, because the Ethiopian government was a key strategic partner of the United States and other Western powers in the ongoing conflict in Somalia against al-Shabaab and other jihadist groups, and because the complexity of the situation resisted the simple narratives that tend to drive international media coverage and political attention. The strategic importance of Ethiopia in the regional security architecture of the Horn of Africa gave the Ethiopian government a degree of international protection from scrutiny that it exercised to limit access to the Ogaden for journalists and humanitarian organizations. For extended periods, the region was effectively closed to independent reporting, which meant that events happening there were known primarily through the accounts of refugees who had managed to leave, through satellite phone calls to diaspora communities, and through the reports of the few organizations with enough access to document conditions on the ground. This limited information environment was not accidental. It was a policy choice, and it contributed to the ongoing invisibility of the Ogaden in international consciousness. The blank space on the political map reinforced by the blank space in the information landscape. I want to talk about water, because in the Ogaden, as in every arid environment, water is not just a resource. It is the organizing principle of everything. The seasonal rivers of the Ogaden, rivers with names like the Wabi Shabelle and the Janale and the Dawa, which originate in the Ethiopian highlands and flow across the plateau toward the sea, are the arteries of the pastoral system. The points where these rivers hold surface water through the dry season, where there are permanent or semi-permanent water sources, are the points around which human activity concentrates, the points where clan territories are negotiated most intensely, the points where conflict over access rights is most likely to break out. The Wabi Shabelle in particular is one of the great rivers of the Horn of Africa, rising in the Ethiopian highlands and flowing some 2,500 kilometers across Ethiopia and Somalia, before losing itself in the swamps and sand flats near the Indian Ocean coast, never quite reaching the sea in most years. The river has sustained agriculture and pastoralism along its banks for thousands of years. Cities and towns grew up along it. The medieval Somali sultanates that controlled trade routes in the interior were organized partly around access to its water, and today the competition over its water between Ethiopia, which is extracting increasing amounts for irrigation projects in the highlands, and Somalia, which depends on the flow that eventually reaches its territory, is a source of tension that adds another dimension to an already complicated relationship between the two states. The towns of the Ogaden, Jijjiga, Gode, Dolo, Kebri Dahar are not the towns of the Ethiopian highlands. They are different in their architecture, their language, their food, their economic life. Jijjiga, the regional capital of the Somali regional state, is a city of markets and mosques and bus stations, connected by roads to Harar and Dire Dawa, and through them to Addis Ababa, but organized internally around the rhythms of a trading center serving a pastoral hinterland. The markets of Jijjiga are where herders sell livestock and buy grain, where the flow of animals from the pastoral system meets the flow of grain and manufactured goods from the settled economy, where the exchange rate between camels and cash that governs pastoral wealth is established by the daily transactions of hundreds of buyers and sellers. The food of Jijjiga and the Ogaden is not Ethiopian highland food. There is no injera here, not in the way it dominates the highland cuisine. The food is closer to the pastoral staples of Somalia: camel's milk, fresh and sour and fermented, which is one of the most nutritionally complete foods available in an arid landscape, and which has sustained pastoralists through droughts that would otherwise have been fatal. Mukmad, dried and clarified camel meat preserved in fat that can be kept for months without refrigeration, which is essentially the pastoral equivalent of pemmican, the high-calorie preserved food that allows long-range mobility without dependence on settled supply chains. Basto, pasta with spiced meat sauce, which reflects the Italian colonial influence on Somali food culture through the former Italian territories, carried by migration and trade into the interior. And tea, always tea, the sweet milky spice tea that is the universal social lubricant of the Horn of Africa, drunk in small glasses in the shade of acacia trees and the covered terraces of tea shops at every hour of the day. The Somali language that is spoken in the Ogaden is not a dialect of some other language, though it has its regional variations. It is one of the Cushitic languages of the Afro-Asiatic family, related to Oromo and Afar and other languages of the Horn of Africa. Somali is one of the rare languages in the world that was codified into a written form relatively recently, with the official Somali script adopted in 1972, but which had an extraordinarily rich oral literary tradition that predated writing by centuries. The poetry of the Somali language, its Gabe and Jifto and Hilo forms, is considered by specialists to be among the most sophisticated oral poetry traditions in Africa, a vehicle for political commentary, religious teaching, philosophical reflection, and the recording of history that served all the functions that written literature serves in other traditions, transmitted entirely through memorization and performance. The great Somali poet Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, known to the British as the Mad Mullah, though he was neither mad nor a mullah in any strict sense, led a resistance movement against British and Italian and Ethiopian control of the Somali territories from 1900 to 1920 that was one of the most sustained and effective anti-colonial insurgencies of the early 20th century, and he did it in part with poetry. His Gabe verses were distributed across the landscape faster than any written document could have traveled, memorized and recited by bards who carried his words from clan to clan, maintaining the morale of his movement and defining its ideology in verse that is still considered among the masterpieces of Somali literature. When we talk about the Ogaden as a blank space, as a territory outside the normal frameworks of legibility that the modern world uses to understand places, it is important to remember that this is a place with a rich intellectual and artistic tradition of its own, one that simply does not translate easily into the forms that external observers are trained to recognize. The collapse of the Somali state in 1991, when the government of Siad Barre was overthrown by a coalition of clan militias, and Somalia descended into a period of statelessness and civil war that in some respects has not yet fully resolved, fundamentally changed the terms of the Ogaden question. Somalia could no longer press its territorial claim through the instruments of a functioning state. There was no government in Mogadishu with enough authority and military capacity to threaten Ethiopia's control of the Ogaden. The strategic calculus of the Cold War that had animated the 1977 war was gone. What remained was the insurgency of the Onlf, fighting for its own agenda of self-determination or independence rather than union with a failed state, and the humanitarian crisis that the combination of drought, conflict, and political marginalization continued to produce in the plateau. The humanitarian situation in the Ogaden has been described by aid workers who have managed to access the region as among the most severe in Africa, which is a region that contains many of the most severe humanitarian situations in the world. The combination of factors is particularly lethal. Recurrent drought, made more severe and more frequent by climate change, that is altering the rainfall patterns that the pastoral system was calibrated to exploit. Conflict that disrupts the pastoral mobility that is the primary mechanism of drought adaptation. Political restrictions that limit the access of humanitarian organizations to affected populations. Poverty that prevents households from building the reserves of wealth and food that would allow them to survive a bad year without destitution. These factors interact and amplify each other in ways that produce a kind of chronic crisis. Not the dramatic acute crisis that generates headline coverage, but a grinding, persistent emergency that kills children and empties villages and forces families to make choices about which members to try to save. The internally displaced people of the Ogaden, the families who have abandoned the pastoral life because their herds were destroyed by drought or raided by militias, or because the grazing they depended on was no longer accessible due to conflict restrictions, now live in camps and peri-urban settlements around the towns of the region, trying to find ways to survive in a sedentary economy that was not designed for them and does not have work for them. The children of these families are growing up without the knowledge of the pastoral system that their parents and grandparents had. The knowledge of how to read the landscape, how to manage camels, how to negotiate water rights, how to move effectively through the seasonal cycle of the Ogaden. When that knowledge is lost, it is not easily recovered. The pastoral system requires not just the physical resources, the animals and the land and the water, but the accumulated knowledge of generations about how to use them. Displacement destroys that knowledge along with everything else. There is a generation of young Somali men in the Ogaden and in the Somali regions of Ethiopia more broadly who have grown up with none of the outlets that previous generations had. They are not pastoralists because the pastoral economy has contracted and their families do not have enough animals to give them a start. They are not farmers because the Ogaden is not primarily an agricultural landscape. They are not educated to the level that would allow them to enter the formal Ethiopian economy in skilled positions. Because the schools in the region are underfunded and understaffed, and the language of instruction in the Ethiopian national system is Amharic, not Somali, which creates an additional barrier for children from Somali-speaking communities. And they have grown up in a landscape defined by armed conflict, which means that joining an armed group is a readily available option in a way that it is not for young people who have other choices. This is not an abstract geopolitical observation. It is a description of an actual demographic reality that produces actual outcomes. The ONSALF has been able to recruit from this pool of young men with limited alternatives. Al-Shabaab, the Somali jihadist organization that controls significant territory in southern Somalia and conducts attacks in Kenya and Ethiopia, has also been able to recruit from this pool, offering a religious framework and an identity, and a sense of purpose to young men who otherwise have none of those things in adequate supply. The blank space on the map, the political and economic marginalization that the blank space represents, is a factory for exactly the kind of armed mobilization that Ethiopia and its international partners are most worried about. The 2018 appointment of Abiy Ahmed as Prime Minister of Ethiopia brought a brief moment of hope for the Ogaden. Abiy released political prisoners, including leaders of the ONSALF, and entered into negotiations with the organization that produced a peace agreement of sorts, with the ONSALF agreeing to transform from an armed insurgent organization into a political party participating in the Ethiopian federal system. Mustafa Omer, one of the ONLEF leaders released from prison, was appointed as president of the Somali regional state. There was a genuine change in the political atmosphere, an opening of space for political activity and civil society organization that had been completely closed under the previous government